As someone who's reviewed over 190 monitors and games competitively on CSGO, I was very much intrigued to see how the HP Omen 25i would compete with some of its rivals. Now the 25i is a full HD 165Hz IPS monitor that runs on a 24.5 inch panel, has G-Sync compatibility, AMD FreeSync as well, and HDR400. Quite a lot in the package right there. Now its price is £250 in the UK and around $300 in the US. So in this review we're going to be seeing if it's worth its price tag. Now before proceeding, if you want to see more independent detailed reviews from the channel, definitely do consider subscribing if you haven't already and hitting that bell notification. It'd be greatly appreciated. So jumping straight into the gaming performance, and here I was actually left very impressed. Now consider I am supreme on both my Smurf and on my main account. I'm really pushing back for my global account after losing it due to hackers, but here I was very much impressed with the overall input lag of the monitor. Indeed, here the monitor has a flawless input lag and competes with the likes of the AOC 24G2U, which is among one of the best budget 1440p IPS monitors out there on the market. Now here I will say that competitive gamers like myself would be very much left impressed. Similarly, if you're going to be using this monitor for other purposes, such as casual gaming or indeed, let's say, console gaming. Now, as for its response time, there are a few different levels to choose from. You'll see them further down in the review in terms of the OSD segment of it, but here I will say dialing it to its almost maximum overdrive setting, in other words its maximum response time setting, in other words level 4, I found that there was very little inverse ghosting and yet the monitor's response time was phenomenal. In its maximum overdrive setting, I felt there was a little bit too much inverse ghosting, even in the likes of playing a potato looking game such as Counter-Strike, and as a result it made me feel a little bit off when it was taking my shots or like swiveling around, let's say, using the AWP. So what I will say here is the response time is actually really impressive, even if you don't dial it in its maximum overdrive settings. Now there's the MPRT mode as well, and we'll talk about how this affects brightness further down in the picture quality section, but here the MPRT mode can be used in order for you to reduce the motion blur. So if that's something that you're going to be using, then feel free to enable it. The only catch here to remember is that if you do enable MPRT mode, you can't run it simultaneously with adaptive sync, in other words AMD FreeSync and or NVIDIA G-Sync. And of course this perfectly leads me on to the segment of AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA G-Sync. Now this monitor is not to be confused with a G-Sync monitor. It doesn't have a G-Sync module built in. It's got an AMD FreeSync technology, in other words it runs an AMD FreeSync Premium Pro if I'm not mistaken, because it's got HDR and Full HD, and it runs at 165Hz, but here it's being tested by NVIDIA, or indeed has got the NVIDIA slap-on logo, and you even see it at the front of the monitor, and here it means that it will run NVIDIA G-Sync as long as you've got the appropriate graphics card. Here I found that I didn't have too many flickering issues or any sort of problems when I was running the NVIDIA G-Sync Pendulum demo, and indeed I was able to utilize NVIDIA G-Sync whilst running this monitor at 1080p and 165Hz, and also simultaneously with HDR as well. So what about its HDR performance? Well, it's got display HDR 400 certification, and quite frankly that is a bit laughable in most scenarios. But what I will say is at this price point it's nice to see actually HDR running pretty well. I played some Destiny 2 and I was left pretty impressed by the overall colours that were being portrayed. It didn't seem overly dull or washed out or anything like that, and provided a nice likeable experience. Is HDR something I would personally use on this monitor as a PC gamer? Absolutely not. I just don't really see the point in HDR 400 point blank. But it's nice to see that it does support an HDR signal, and in this respect gives it a little bit of a unique selling point over the likes of, let's say, the AOC 24G2U. So to summarize, the gaming performance of this monitor is actually phenomenal. I will see myself playing competitively on this monitor. I can see myself playing casual games on this monitor, and I could just see using it on a daily basis. Now why is that? Well, that's also because it's got a very beautiful IPS panel, and this again leads me into the picture quality section. Now the picture quality section here, you should be mindful that there's a few different OSD menus that you can flick through. The two that we'll be concentrating on are the standard and native mode. So let's kick things off and talk about standard mode. Here I feel standard is the equivalent of sRGB emulation mode, and here you'll be able to see on your screen that it hits 98.8% of the gamut coverage and 104.2% in the sRGB volume. You can see here how it looks in comparison to the sRGB standard, and in terms of color accuracy it has an average delta of 1.57 and a maximum of 2.44 with a contrast ratio of 1033 to 1. Ultimately, these results are pretty impressive for a monitor of its class, not quite AOC 24 GTU standard, but extremely impressive nevertheless. So why would I ever talk about the other mode, native mode? Well, that's because to my eyes, native mode just seems to pop a little bit more. And it's unsurprising because this monitor is actually a DCI-P3 monitor. In other words, even HP talk about DCI-P3 coverage. And indeed here, native mode seems to really rely to the DCI-P3 standard rather than the sRGB standard. And therefore will make image, well, look a little bit more vivid. Now here, if you can see the sRGB coverage as 99.9%, but the gamut volume exceeds it at 139%. And here you can see the Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 coverages seem to get tightened up in comparison to the standard mode that we were at. And indeed here you can see it far exceeds the sRGB standard because it's a wide color gamut monitor. Now here the average delta against the sRGB standards drops to 2.23 and has a maximum of 5.91, whilst contrast ratio increases slightly at 1100 to 1. Ultimately here the native modes that you can enable via the OSD provides a little bit of a more eye-popping color, but won't be accurate to the sRGB standard. Should you care about all of this? Well, if you're a gamer, just lower it on native and adjust the brightness. If you are someone who's going to be editing, in other words, picture editing or video grading or something like that, you might want to consider running it in its standard mode instead. Now, of course, there is another catch to this, and that's to do with its overall brightness. Depending on the modes that you use, you'll have a different brightness. Now this is tested against the SDR mode, so in other words, running an SDR signal. And here you can see the maximum brightness in standard mode is 338 with a minimum of 57 nits, whilst in native mode, this increases up to 360 nits. In other words, the native mode seems to be brighter. Now to throw another spanner in the works, there is of course MPRT mode, which I talked about in the gaming section. And here, this will affect the overall brightness depending on which level you run. It's unsurprising here because it's the same sort of behavior you'll see on other monitors out there on the market. You've got 5 levels to choose from, and you can see here it does affect the brightness. 363 nits in native mode with MPRT level 0. This drops to 350 nits, then 300 nits, then 253 nits, then 200 nits, and then down to 153 nits in its minimum level. And this is 100% brightness, level 5 MPRT, native mode. So hopefully that makes sense and should give you an indication. Now moving on from here, we get onto brightness uniformity. And here the brightness uniformity is, well, somewhat average, potentially a little bit disappointing. Of course it is panel lottery, but here you can see that the monitor doesn't do too well in terms of the top segment of this monitor. And the same could be said about backlight bleed. Given it's an IPS monitor, you do notice a little bit of backlight bleed. Is it acceptable? Absolutely. I had no problems gaming at night on CSGO or let's say Destiny 2 with or without HDR enabled. And truthfully, IPS monitors, most of them have some form of IPS bleed, and as I did mention before, it is somewhat panel lottery. Now moving on to the monitor's OSD that can be accessed through a little joystick button found at the bottom right and behind the monitor, you'll find a very comprehensive list of options. Now small note over here, if you want to access MPRT, you'll have to have adaptive sync disabled, so something that you should be mindful of. Now the rest of the options here, so for example frame rate, crosshair, message timer, multi-monitor align, are as the name might suggest, and these are kind of virtual icons that will also appear. As for shadow vision and edge precision, these are HP features which try to enhance the image. In my opinion, I left them disabled. As for response time, I leave it on level 4 as I mentioned before in the gaming section, but of course you can dial this to whatever you see fit, and the same goes with MPRT and and or adaptive sync if you choose to have that enabled or disabled. As for the image, well, it is self-explanatory with the different options. I left the dynamic contrast as off, but of course you might want that enabled. And as for sharpness, I left it to its default level, which is level 4. Now as for color, as I did mention in the picture quality section, you've got different modes to choose from, and standard and native are probably the two that you're going to be flicking through. And in my opinion, native looks good to the naked eye. However, standard looks better for, well, if you're going to be editing in sRGB. Now it's good to see also you've got RGB gain adjust as well, which is just a nice little touch, and this can be accessed over here as well. Inputs, pretty much self-explanatory. Power, also self-explanatory. You can also disable the power LED, which appears at the bottom right corner of the monitor, so it's a nice little small touch for those people who do not want a light shining in their face, even though it's a very small one. Then you've got the OSD customization, and then you've got some information that you can seek out from the monitor. Now the Omen 25i also has a software-based OSD via the Omen Gaming Hub, but it's a lot less comprehensive than the hardware OSD. As you can see here, you've got a few picture modes that you can flick through, and in the settings, as you can see, it's rather basic. There isn't as many options as you can see in the hardware OSD. What is nice, however, is that you can customize certain things. So for example, if you're going to be using the crosshair overlay and you enable it, what you'll find is that you can customize the color, you can even customize the type of crosshair that it is. The same goes with the FPS counter and the game timer. Now with the OSD section out of the way, let's get onto the build quality and design, and here I've got a little bone to pick with HP, and that's to do with its stand. While I do like its nice looking stand, and it definitely does look pretty stylish, it only provides a tilt adjustment, and as such is not great for ergonomics because you've got no height adjustment, pivot or anything like that, unlike some of its competitors that offer a fully adjustable stand, meaning you can get the right posture or indeed the right sort of height for your needs. Now you can change the stand because it's got a VESA compatible stand, so therefore you can adjust another stand if you so wish, but I just wish HP had addressed this rather than looking to style and looking for more towards a practicality side of the equation. Now the stand itself is very sturdy, I had no issues whatsoever, and the monitor itself is beautifully built. It's got a 3-side borderless design, and the bottom edge bezel is not too thick either. Ultimately here the design of the monitor is very nice, practicality not so much. And so this all leads me on to my verdict. Would I recommend the HP Omen 25i? Well, it's quite an interesting one because fundamentally the monitor is absolutely phenomenal. It's got great gaming credentials and of course gaming performance. It's got a really nice design. It also supports HDR if you're going to use that, but it is limited in terms of its stand. Arguably that is one of its weakest points, which is something potentially a little bit trivial for some people out there. The big point to say over here is in comparison to its competitors, it is more expensive. Here it comes in at £250 in the UK, and at that price point you have to consider that the AOC 24 GTU can be had for around £180 to £190. That monitor and that panel provides a IPS 144Hz 1080p panel, and it's just phenomenal across the board, both in terms of color accuracy and gaming performance. It does not have 165Hz, but I'll be very hard pressed if you could tell me the difference between 165Hz and 144Hz, let alone 240Hz, but that's a different conversation. And then also, in terms of going between the two monitors, that the AOC monitor provides a fully adjustable stand, whilst the HP provides a fixed stand. So why would you buy the HP Omen 25i? Well, quite frankly, if you are a competitive gamer, want a color accurate monitor, and you want HDR in there, then this monitor is arguably the best pick for you. Is it the monitor I would personally recommend? No, it's the AOC 24G2U, and at a stretch you've even got the BenQ EX2510 and the S variant, which is coming out very soon, to consider as well. Now, nevertheless, I feel that it would be very cruel of me to go off this review and not actually commend HP for what they've achieved over here, and as a result it gets my performance award because it's a high performance monitor, but not the monitor I would recommend for the price that it's coming in at. So of course that's just my honest independent review of the HP monitor. I'll be intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comment section below, and of course which monitor would you pick? AOC, BenQ, or the HP Omen? Let me know in the comment section below, and of course if you like this video, drop a like, subscribe, and hit that bell notification. It'd be greatly appreciated. Alright, I've been Totally Dubbed, take care of yourselves, and goodbye.